So thank you very much for attending. And of course, we've just heard the latest OECD Global Economic Outlook. And I'm very happy to say that we will be having a panel discussion about some of the main points that came up in that presentation. Now, the panel title is Employment, Digitalization, and Productivity. But just to give you an idea, I'm going to divide it into 3 segments. So we're going to go over the state of the global economy today. The second segment is some of the challenges facing the global economy today. And the third is what policymakers can do to counter those challenges and what reforms need to be done to pick up on the Secretary General's comments and the Chief Economist that we just heard from. A bit of housekeeping just before I start. You are encouraged to participate, so please do. I believe you have a BCAS system, so you can send through questions. I will be taking a look at them, and if anything pops up, then I will definitely ask our panelists those questions as well. And then also feel free to tweet about the forum as well with the hashtag OECD Forum, and I think you've been, that's the same Twitter hashtag you will be using the next couple of days as well. But before we start with the panel, I want to introduce who our panelists are. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Richard Trumka, the President of the American Federation of Labor, Congress of Industrial Organizations, and Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD. Thank you, Rich. On my right, I have Mr. David Parker, the Attorney General, Minister for Economic Development, Environment, Trade and Export Growth, and Associate Minister of Finance of New Zealand, also known as the man of many titles, David Parker. On my left, I'm very happy to say that I've got Felipe Larin, the Finance Minister of Chile. Welcome. And on his left, we have Mrs. Dana Rezinesi-Ozaula, Finance Minister from Latvia. And then finally, Phil O'Reilly, the Chair of the Business and Industry Advisory Committee as well. So thank you all very much. So we've just heard from the OECD that global growth is back to 3.9%, very close to that 4%, but also decent recovery given that only a few years ago we were looking at a global growth environment of 3.1%. David, I'd like to start with you if possible and just ask you about how robust and how resilient you think the global economy is today. Simple question.
Better than it was a year ago. I thought the messages that we just heard, that it's still overly reliant on fiscal and monetary stimulus, is correct. One of the more interesting comments for me was that, and I wrote it down at the time, that political economy is creeping into processes and slowing reforms down. As a politician, that doesn't surprise me, and I looked at a couple of the stats that are in this paper, which I think are driving that political economy response. And for those who've got it, on pages 21 and 22, there's a statement there and some graphs saying many households have seen little growth in real disposable income over the past decade, particularly those with low income. Soft wage growth is contributing to popular dissatisfaction with economic performance. And then on the next page, there's a graph that shows the ever-increasing annual disparity in between households with high incomes, with low incomes. And if I had a criticism of this report, it's that the compounding effects of these huge disparities in income on wealth distribution are not well explored in most countries of the world, nor in the OECD. And I know from my own country that the backlash against trade, which we've experienced like a lot of other countries, is founded in an insecurity of the middle class, which is caused by those compounding effects of annual income inequality. So if I had what I think is the challenge for the world, it's actually to deal with this inequality of wealth distribution, which of course will be not just eroding political support for reform, but it's also holding down consumptive demand pressures in the economy, because so much of the world's income and wealth has been concentrated in the hands of the few.
So we'll get into some of those challenges shortly. One other thing that came out of the presentation for me, just one follow-up question for you, David, is that almost 50% of the growth, they said, is coming from China and India. And I thought that was quite an alarming number. And given New Zealand's trading ties with China, how are you thinking about it domestically?
Well, we've actually got a very good trading relationship with China. It's one of our two largest partners. The trade is in balance across goods and services, and it's really important to us. We've benefited from the growth of China, as has most other countries in the world, and we continue to see that as an important relationship. We do have wider concerns about the erosion of the support for the rules-based framework. Multilateralism is incredibly important to us, but our response to the erosion of multilateralism is to be pushing hard on plurilateralism in agreements that are designed to be open to those countries that want to join them. So other countries who have dismay at the decline in multilateralism, there are more choices coming through plurilateralism, which may be a bulwark against some of that rising protectionism.
Mr. Larian, I'd like to ask you your thoughts as well on growth. Yesterday on CNBC, we had Mohammed Al-Arian come on the show, and he said that people are confusing coincidental growth with synchronized growth, in the sense that it just happen to occur that many of these economies tend to be growing at the same time. But actually, if you strip things down to basics, the only economy that's really growing and has legs is the US. What do you think?
Well, first of all, I think we should partially celebrate because the world economy is doing better, but I think that we should have caution here, because the first thing is not to overstate the current recovery, because we are just coming from 3.7% growth in 2017 to 3.8. I mean, that's good, but saying that we're going into a new momentum of growth, the real increase in growth was between 16 and 17, when growth went from 3.2 to 3.7. There was a half percentage point increase of growth in that year. What we're seeing here is good, but I would point to some of the issues. Well, you are talking about synchronized growth. The first thing I would say, which is not mentioned here, and probably because it's not mentioned in the report, but because it's a more recent development, is the fact that the true growth, as you're saying, is coming from the US, and you're seeing some desynchronization, some weakness in a few European markets, that we're not having a totally synchronized growth. We have a lot at stake in one economy. And even if we focus in the short term, we have the issue of higher interest rates coming from the Fed, taking away the stimulus. But in the longer term, you have an issue that we haven't talked about, and to me is one of the problems that we have, and one of the very important potential risks, which is fiscal policy in the US. And in particular, the tax reform, which will imply an increase in the fiscal deficit of about $1.5 trillion. Well, you can say, well, that's their problem. No, it's our problem. It's a problem for all of us. Because $1.5 to $1.8 trillion, it's a range of estimates, means that long-term rates are starting to shoot up, and you have the 10-year bond over 3.1, and we are all looking at this, and as Warren Buffett used to say, when the tide is high, we're all swimming beautifully. But when the tide goes down, you can see who's really swimming naked.
So you do agree with the assessment that fiscal policy then in the US is short-term beneficial, but in the long term will actually backfire?
Well, I have my doubts, and I would very much hope that you have the growth closing the gap, but growth can close part of the gap, and we still have a very big gap. And we are watching a scenario where interest rates are going up. So I think our fiscal policies, and maybe I'm going into a second part of the issue, but our fiscal policies have to be very responsive to this, and I see a very significant risk in pro-cyclical policies at this stage. In fact, what we should have is precisely the opposite. Fiscal policy should be counter-cyclical, and you should have the institutions that are built so that you can have this counter-cyclical policy.
Now, one topic that you brought up was the fact that there was uneven distribution of growth. You mentioned Europe. We have a European specialist in the room, Mr. Zola. I'd like to ask you about what's happening in European growth, because we've seen the momentum slow down quite a lot in the first quarter of this year. Do you think that we've reached the peak of the cycle as far as European growth is concerned here?
You know, the last year's growth level was the highest within the 10 years' time in the European Union, and we finally reached the point when each and every country experienced the positive growth and the positive economic sentiment. And I think that one of the major aspects that the politicians have to keep into the mind is really giving the businesses the sense of the security. Because yes, we were discussing a lot that we have to push on the monetary policies. Then we saw that, oh, it doesn't work quite right. The investment is not growing. Then we added the fiscal policies on top of that. Finally, we see some positive growth in the investment. And first we see that there is this inertia. The second one, I think, even though there was the external preconditions for the additional investment already for several years, the businesses were quite cautious in investing. And that's because I think it was kind of a more emotional and internal feeling and the sense of instability, which is also the case today. This is what makes me a bit cautious on the future prospect. Nevertheless, for the following 2 years, we would see additional benefits coming from the fiscal and monetary policies. But this geopolitical tectonic movements and the trade policy restrictions are those that might have much bigger negative effect on businesses than we would expect today. And this is one thing the politicians have to keep in mind, as I said, really sticking together with their political and economical partners, be consistent, persistent and rational in their policies for the European Union, for the Eurozone, continue the policies showing that there is this persistence and stability. And for us, of course, it is deepening the EMU, finalizing the banking union, reducing the risks before sharing the risks and implementing the structural reforms so much necessary.
Now, the Secretary General has referred to policy crutches, and we talk about policy crutches in the sense that growth is being lifted up by fiscal policy, but also by monetary policy as well. Now, one thing that comes up a lot in the context of Europe is that perhaps some people are saying that a lot of the growth can be attributed back to the ECB and years of accommodative monetary policy, years of quantitative easing. Do you think that's fair?
I think that the countries that have been really putting their card on the structural reforms do already experience the more positive growth rates than the rest of the European countries. Take as an example Latvia. We've used our fiscal policy to really implement the notable structural reforms, strengthening the labor market, reducing the inequality, and what we see, there is the short-term effect of the positive economic sentiment, and we do believe that there would be the long-term effect of a more sustainable growth. And we did start this year with 4.3% growth rates. It's quite huge in comparison to the 2.4 approximately in the Eurozone and European Union.
Outperformance.
So the payback.
Phil, I want to ask you about what you're hearing from businesses.
Well, obviously good news in the context of the top line growth, and there's two statistics that were just mentioned in the report which illustrate that. Unemployment next year going to be the lowest since 1980. Now some noise in those numbers, but that's a good number. The second thing that really mattered to me when I looked at that, and this is what I'm hearing too from the business community, is that you're starting to see investment in plant and equipment, and that's very, very important because that suggests that businesses are now starting to invest in the future, and they weren't doing that in the early days of quantitative easing and fiscal easing. And the reason was, I think, primarily when I talked to them, was that despite the fact that money was cheap, they couldn't see a market to invest into. There wasn't the confidence about that. So the fact that they're starting to employ people, the fact that they're starting to invest in plant and equipment suggests that they are seeing a real future forward. The problem is that we did a survey of our member confederations of BIAC just last week. And what we found was that half of the members were feeling pretty good they were still feeling good. That was the same as last year. About 50% of them were saying economic conditions are reasonably good. Last year, there were 7% of them said they're bad, or they're not so good. This year, 25% said not so good. So the people that were in the middle, it's not so good, not so bad, have now gone towards maybe it's bad.
What do you think is driving their concern?
Well, we think three things. One is the obvious stuff, tariff wars, political uncertainty about the future of the global multilateral trading system and so on. That's Brexit. There's a group of that stuff. There's a second group of things where businesses are concerned about governments taking unilateral action when really a multilateral approach is best. Some of that is the same stuff, but some of it's also, for example, unilaterally moving forward on tax reform when hopefully everybody would be playing the team game around BEPS, driven by the OECD. And the third thing is very much what we just heard, actually a real concern about a slowing down in the reform agenda, a real concern that the nice stuff around quantitative easing and fiscal policy is great, but gee, everybody recognises that when you look out into the medium term, you're going to need much more than that, and those kind of pro-growth reforms. Just for example, most of our members have seen no improvement in investment conditions this year, no investment policies from member states. Well, that's a bad idea. You need to get those kinds of pro-growth reforms going. So those are the risks that we see going ahead.
Richard, I want to turn to you. You've been sitting very patiently on the right-hand side. There were some very interesting charts that we just saw now about the extent of job creation we've seen in the world, particularly in the US. The job growth creation has been outstanding there, but it hasn't translated into higher real wages, essentially. What is the problem?
Well, you've seen slow growth. We still have projected slow growth. We're seeing, as Guria says, we're on fiscal crutches, and it's a moderately optimistic picture, I guess, of the future. But we saw that there's lower wages are lower. The participation in the market, working market, employment market is lower. And we see continued attacks on worker organizations. We see, we're not seeing, and let me respond to both Phil and the finance minister from Chile, we're not seeing the investment, even though we're seeing huge corporate profits. We've seen 3 years of record profits, and we're seeing double-digit returns on assets in OECD country after OECD country. But we're not seeing it put back into the things it should be for productive growth. And Phil was right, I think, because of the lack of demand. We're seeing it plowed back into stock buybacks. We're seeing it plowed back into dividends. And we're not seeing it come back in the form of...
Are you talking specifically about the latest tax reform measures that were passed by the U.S.?
No, I was talking about the OECD. The tax reform measures in the United States were also geared towards the very, very top. Those at the bottom and the middle get precious little. There's a band in the middle that will actually pay higher taxes, and those at the top in corporate America are going to do real well because all the money, the tax breaks are going to them, which will increase the deficit, which will take less money, more money away from investment. You ask why we're not seeing the wage growth. Part of it is when people talk about structural reform, I wish it was about simply investment in skills and vocation, in tax reform to help lower and middle income wages and reducing tariff barriers. But too often, what it really is code. It's code for shifting the risk from business to workers, from the collective to the individual, a code word for weakening bargaining power. And quite frankly, weakening bargaining power is about the worst thing you could do right now. Because if wages are stagnant, wages are flat, they're never going to go up if you continue to weaken bargaining structures and bargaining power of the individuals. We have to make them stronger, balance out the power, so that wages can continually go up in a negotiated manner. We're not seeing that, and our fear is that whenever you say structural reform, no one really defines it carefully. Today, the chief economist circumscribed it by saying three things. He said, investment in skills and vocation, we agree. Tax reform to help people in the lower and middle income, we agree. Reduce trade barriers, we agree. But if it's a code word to go after labor and labor organizations, it's a bad idea economically, And it's a worse idea politically, because the more workers are weakened, the more the attacks on democracy itself have legitimacy.
On that note, I'm going to put all of you on the spot, if I may, and ask you out of which one of these do you think is the biggest risk to markets and the biggest risk to the global economic outlook? And I'm going to draw on some of the comments from the Secretary General. The first is a trade war and what that means for business sentiment. The second is that of higher oil prices due to geopolitical tensions. The third is inflationary pressure that causes the Fed to over-tighten interest rates, and that has repercussions on, let's say, emerging markets. And the last one, and this is a new one, and I can't be on a panel discussing the global outlook without bringing this up, financial contagion from the Eurozone after we've seen a big repricing of Italian assets in the last couple of days. So what would be your number one risk?
Well, I don't think oil prices in the short term or mid-term are going to be a risk, because I think Russia and OPEC just indicated that they're going to open the faucet, which would have a downward pressure on oil prices. I don't think that inflation is something to be screamed about right now, because it's low and it's controlled in most places. I think the chance of a trade war, if that happened, I think that could be a danger. But I think as long as we continue to talk and try to solve problems in trade and create trade balances with everybody, I think that can be managed as well. In the United States, we have almost a $800 billion trade deficit. We've had that deficit for year after year after year after year. There is a structural imbalance there that has to be corrected when countries don't play by the same rules as everyone else, when they dump, when they illegally subsidize, when they do those things, there has to be a corrective measure. And that's not a threat to the economy or to the future. That's actually, I think, something that can be positive to the future, because if we create trade rules that are fair and even and everybody plays by the same rules, then I think everybody has a chance to compete, and comparative advantage then can actually take over, and it can be a good thing for the world economy.
Okay, interesting perspective there. David, do you agree?
Yeah, I would say the greatest risk is trade wars, but I would say that the political economy that lies under that risk relates to the unfairnesses that are so at large in the world. You know, asset prices have gone through the roof. Quantitative easing has largely benefited those who already owned assets, because their asset prices have been bid up around the world. Many of the companies have managed to themselves had, pretty concentrated ownership amongst a very small percentage of the world population. Have further concentrated that by buying back their own stocks. I think if you want to avoid rising trade wars, you've got to do some of the things like, push against multinational tax avoidance, as well as try and get some more fairness into income distribution. I fear that that's going to be very difficult, given that one of the things that we are seeing is the consequences of the changing patterns of work caused by technology. The future of work is happening now, and those who are young people or lower skilled are the canary in the mines. But of those lists, I think trade wars is the greatest risk, certainly is to us in New Zealand.
Do you agree with Richard that some aspects of trading need to be modified, though, in the sense that it has been unfair and the system has allowed for certain countries and certain people to take more advantage of these trade rules than others?
There is some legitimacy to some of those points, but I'm concerned that you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think that some points have already been made. One of my roles as Attorney General, I believe that the rule of law is fundamentally important. The rule of law protecting contract and property rights is a precondition to investment. The international rule of law relating to trade is an important part of the rule of law when the appellate body stops functioning, the enforcement mechanisms under the WTO become severely undermined, and you'll see even more inappropriate trade behaviour if that comes to pass, and therefore we've got to avoid that abyss. As I've said to you previously, we don't have great confidence in New Zealand, despite our long support for multilateral institutions since World War II across all areas of policy, be it security, environment or trade. We're not completely confident that we're going to win that battle, so we're putting more and more effort into plurilateral alternatives like CPTPP, RCEP and other plurilateral negotiations, as well as bilaterals. They, of course, are inferior to a decent WTO operating mechanism, but we've got to guard against it. And it may well be that through the countries that really do believe in multilateralism, working together through plurilateralism, that we actually create the pressure that we need to make multilateralism work again.
Did you have a quick comment, Richard?
I did. The multilateral institutions, if you will, I think one of the real dangers to them is they must become more inclusive and they must become more democratic. They cannot be dominated by large global corporations or by any individual country or two. They have to become more inclusive and more democratic. If they don't, that's a real threat to multilateralism in the long run. And the OECD can actually play a tremendous role in bringing that about. They have the structural thing right here that because of Ms. Angel Gurria's hard work and the staff's hard work, they have a thing called inclusive growth. And if that can be instilled in the WTO and all the multilateral organizations and democratic institutions as well, then I think you'll see the world do a whole lot better and the risk is less.
I'm not sure I agree with that. And, as a little country at the bottom of the world, actually, I think the answer to most of these things lies in cooperative relationships, give and take, rather than moving away from consensus. It requires everyone in the room to want to find a consensus rather than to use their power to avoid one.
I'm going to move on and ask Mr. Larien how you're thinking about it. Is your base case that extra tariffs are eventually going to get imposed? And if so, how can you avoid a further escalation of trade tensions?
Well, I think, and this I would agree with my colleague from New Zealand, that the biggest risk of all is a full-fledged trade war. I think this is the biggest risk, but I don't think this is a very high probability event. At this stage, we're seeing trade tensions reduce, but I wouldn't say that they have been completely diffused, or completely eliminated. We still have trade tensions. So with a trade war, you start a trade war, and I would say no one in his right mind, no country in his right mind will start a trade war to do a damage to the country. But the problem with a trade war is that you know how it starts, but you don't know how it follows. Because what you're trying to do, suppose you give the benefit of the doubt, and you're trying to open markets, by threatening, or by saying, I'm going to impose tariffs. But then the country will not stand idle. The country that is affected will say, okay, I'm going to increase tariffs too. And then products flow to third countries and provoke tensions, trade tensions in third countries, which may be drawn in. So that's why, and coming from a country like, especially coming from a country like Chile, my own country, where we have free trade agreements that cover 64 countries, which is about 95% of our exports, go to markets with which we have free trade agreements. Even for us, we say, well, we are protected. No, I think we will also suffer. We may be in a better position, but we will all suffer in a trade war. So I would say so that's the biggest risk. There is a fundamental, I would say, a short-term risk now on financial contagion, on the issue of financial contagion. Financial markets are nervous, and are looking at countries that are vulnerable, and they try to look one country, one thing happens in Italy, and they go looking to other countries that, they think they're similar, EMs and other countries elsewhere. So I would say that is another risk. But I would say also, and I would place emphasis on what I think that the fundamental risk of complacency. And complacency is looking that the world economy picks up, that you are there, that you are a commodity exporter, and so commodity prices go up. And we should be very clear, even for commodity exporting countries, the dependence of growth is only partially on your commodity price, even if you're a commodity producer. The biggest part of the effort has to be done internally for sustaining long-term growth. If you want to sustain growth, just not look at the commodity price. You should do the things that are required to sustain that growth, and this has to do with institutional reform. But believing that just you dance at the tone of the world economy, I think is not right.
Another aspect that I would like to add on this topic of the trade wars, I think it's dangerous not only because of the immediate effects that we would see, higher costs for trading, but it is also the indicator of the lack of the dialogue. And we just heard that it's very important to have the coordination of the policies. If you are in the trade wars, that means also that you have less dialogue, less opportunities to coordinate the policies. And this is of high importance to have this coordination, especially within the context of the digitalization, and name the tax reform. As long as we would have the sense that there would be no opportunity to come to the common agreement on the international stage, at least at the OECD level, the short-term solutions would be found. And the short-term solutions, which are not global, would not be efficient enough. So that is one thing that I also see as the drawback of the current tension and the lack of the dialogue.
Phil, just as far as businesses are concerned, what does it mean for overall competitiveness? Because we've talked about it obviously at a national level, but then on a business level, supply chains are going to be disrupted. Inflationary, we're talking about inflationary costs at all segments of the production. What is the feedback that you're getting from businesses, and how are they thinking about these potential new tariffs in the future?
Yeah, if we looked at those four that you raised, I was going to say trade as well as the biggest one. The reason is it's so corrosive. And it affects your confidence, because if you, as a business person, think, well, if these rules can be broken and these rules can be changed, what else? So what else is secure in this rules-based system? Because businesses will have a lot of confidence about investing, or more confidence about investing, if they know they're investing in a set of rules that everybody complies with. So that is no doubt the biggest risk. And I completely agree with my Chilean colleague that the problem is not just between those who start the trade wars and those who are the immediate target. To take an example, one of the countervailing tariffs that's being talked about from China relates to, wouldn't you know it, food. And now my colleague and I are going to be a bit worried about that, because our two countries, New Zealand and Chile, are really food exporting nations. If I was to think, though, from a business perspective, I think what I'd say to you is that the biggest risk of all is inaction. The biggest risk of all, exactly the same point my Chilean colleague was making, the biggest risk is that we say, well, let's do nothing and let's just hope. And maybe we'll be a victim of these things, maybe we won't be, but we'll just wait. That's a bad idea. What we need to be doing right now is thinking about domestic competitiveness and domestic productivity, and making sure that as far as possible our economies are fit for the kinds of shocks that might come along, not just the trade shock, but also a financial shock or an oil shock. That's about getting on with the domestic reform agenda, and it's about doing the sorts of things that the OECD is talking about.
I'm going to come back to the productivity point, but just one question on financial contagion I'd like to ask you, Ms. Azolas. We have seen those big moves in Italy the past couple of days. Many people are getting concerned about the impact that sort of price action is going to have on the rest of the Eurozone. Not asking you to opine on market moves, but do you think this type of market activity will eventually have an impact on growth?
Definitely. I think we can see what impact the Brexit has already caused to the European Union in general. And if Italy fails to form a government that might be still pro-European and still dedicated to the reforms and getting the country also back on, within the fiscal stance, that might be a much bigger harm to the whole concept of the European Union than we expect. I mean, we could handle Greece. Italy would be, we could and will handle Brexit. Italy would be too much, I think.
Mr. Larian, do you have a comment on financial contagion, especially as it pertains to emerging markets? You touched on that briefly. You said, investors were very quick to draw parallels between Italy and Greece and then start attacking emerging countries one by one. Is that fair, or is that just expected because people are getting a little bit jittery about the outlook?
Well, life is not completely fair, and we should say, whether contagion is fair. Well, if you remember at the time of the Asian crisis, there was Russia being hit, and then after Russia was hit, the contagion came to Brazil, and Brazil and Russia had very little to do, in terms of trade flows or, some kind of, integration of their economies. It's just the fact that, asset managers who were holding emerging market assets said, well, I need to sell some asset which is liquid. And so when, investors came to get back their contributions to the funds, they said we should sell Brazil. So that's how it operates. The question is that we are in an environment that is nervous about the increase in interest rates, that the condiment here being, in the case of Italy, a political issue, but you have very high levels of debt, and the countries that are very highly indebted, particularly the public sector, markets will look, as interest rates go up, they will look in more detail to them, and the parallels would not just be among countries in the EU, but they will go to other countries elsewhere. So we shouldn't believe that contagion is a purely geographical issue. It just happens to be, to have contagion among countries that have similar economic issues in very different latitudes. So I think that is a very essential thing, so that this is what, and I betray my academic background. I'm a minister of finance, but only for 4.5 years. I've been a professor all my life, and we used to study this as a pure contagion, the contagion that comes purely from financial markets with countries that have nothing to do. So we should build our defenses, and in building the defenses is the institutional reforms that need to be taken on the fiscal issues and others.
In an environment of rising interest rates, and a lot of that, of course, goes back to the Fed and the US Central Bank. How are you thinking about what the Fed is doing from an outsider's perspective? Are you concerned that a tightening of financial conditions is going to have repercussions on your part of the world as well?
Not a top-of-mind concern for us in New Zealand at the moment. It has seemed aberrant to us, perhaps simple folk in the bottom of the South Pacific, that in different parts of the world you have to pay the bank to save money. And that doesn't seem to be a recipe for
it's a European thing.
Incentives to save and invest, really. But there does need to be a return to norms sometime. And so if you don't do it now, when do you do it? In respect of the issues that you were just earlier talking to, look, I don't know the answers to that. Again, I wonder if some mistakes were made about in respect of the large debt that was owed earlier by the Greek economy to private banks, that so much of that managed to be socialised rather than those private lenders taking the haircut that they probably should have. And as a consequence, what happens in subsequent one country crises having the ability to flow on to other countries, and more broadly, as perhaps maybe the seeds were sown then.
Rich, can I ask you what you think it means for the consumer? Because obviously, as we heard from the chief economist, it means higher mortgage bills, higher credit card bills. So as interest rates go up, you're probably going to be left with less discretionary spending. And then also it's combined with a time when oil prices are also going up as well. So ultimately, isn't this just going to push real wages even lower?
Well, it could, because it could choke demand. It could also choke lending. I mean, if the interest rates go up too fast and people tighten credit too much, then there won't be the lending, either individually or commercially, that you need. Could also have where there won't be enough disposable income afterwards for people to be able to buy anything, so you have a decrease in demand and you start spiraling downward. So yeah, we're very, very concerned about both of those. And if you get the confluence of higher interest rates, higher gasoline prices and oil prices, and then a drop in wages, you have the perfect storm that leads us back to 2008.
Now let's talk about how we can counter all of that. And it seems very clear from the discussions that we just had and also from the presentation that in order to boost wages, you need to boost productivity. What measures do we need to see?
Well, let me back up a step. Just because you boost productivity doesn't mean wages go up. In the United States, productivity from 1946 to 1973, productivity doubled, and so did wages. In the mid-70s, fiscal policies and monetary policies started to conspire, and a tax on working groups started to conspire, and productivity went up, but wages went flat. And while productivities continued to grow, perhaps not at quite the same rate, but still a significant rate, wages have remained flat. That's where inclusiveness comes in. So if all you're doing is growing and all the money's going to the top 1 or 2%, as it is in the United States and not to everybody else, you'll continue to see a crisis of demand because there isn't a disposable income that you need to be able to drive demand. And so we see that as a real danger to us in the process.
David, I'd like to ask you as well what you think needs to be done on the reform side, not just to deal with this issue of income distribution, but also, as you mentioned, and you talked about this, reforming some of the multilateral types of discussions and treaties that exist.
Well, I think the rule of law always needs to be enforced. So I think the most important thing to protect in the multilateral institutions at the moment that's up for grabs is the appellate body. And we all need to be putting efforts, as I know we are, to finding a solution there. And that's not to say that some of the criticisms of the appellate body might not be valid, but we need to find whatever the solutions are. Actually, in terms of the productivity challenge, you know, I think it's the duty of every government in the world to be maximising their share of the new innovations that arise from the confluence of, you know, big data, the Internet of Things, sensors, positioning systems, and robotics, because we all need to grow new points of comparative advantage to sell our products efficiently, to produce our products efficiently, and to involve ourselves in global value chains. So in terms of where structural policies should be pushing, I agree with the summary that the OECD put up on the screen. You know, we know what the solutions are. You know, moving more capital into higher asset prices is not the answer.
Mr. Larian, just drawing again on the OECD comments, they said, you know, that they've been arguing that there's been a significant slowdown in the reform measures in the last couple of years, even though obviously growth has been picking up. Is that a fair assessment in your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this issue of reform fatigue that, yes, you know, I think countries, the issue here is that the reliance, if your reliance is just on, you know, the global recovery and basically on monetary and fiscal policy, and that's where you're drawing your momentum for growth, well, that is a very weak base, and you probably have, there are very few countries that have space, fiscal space, you know, and monetary policy is probably, you know, you don't have much more space in monetary policy. In fact, you have the reversal of the easing cycle right now. So yes, I think that what countries should be doing, and particularly when the world economy is picking up, is a good time to go and do, you know, some particular institutional reforms. So let me point to one, which I think is important, on the fiscal area. is to go from just spending based on current income to a rule, a fiscal rule, that spends according to your structural or your long-term revenues, for the government. So you do your budget based on long-term revenues, not just on current revenues. That's a structural fiscal rule. There are several countries that have it, among them Chile, but also Colombia, Peru, Mexico, in Latin America. And I think it's a good idea that you don't spend just out of your current income. And that is a way to do a counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Let me call a second issue. A second reform is on your banking system and the financial markets. I think overall, there's one issue which is the harmonization of regulations, and there are many institutions, among them the OECD, that is working on that, Basel rules. And countries are trying to go in their banking systems to Basel III right now. And Basel III means higher capital requirements, so you have a more robust banking system. And I think that is a second very important thing. The harmonization of institutions and of regulation, I think, is an issue that is of very big concern for all of us, and where the OECD has a lot to do. Let's go, for example, fintech. Fintech is an area where we now have to deal. All countries have to deal with the new financial technologies, and some of them are very good, but others, we should be aware what the risks are in some of this, for example, on the crypto assets. Mm-hmm. And so I think the space for cooperation in many of these things, in the harmonization of regulations, in having common standards, and in addressing some of the common threats that we have is very big.
Now, just to pick up on your point on fiscal spending and counter-cyclical measures, I want to ask you about Europe, because, of course, Eurozone countries are bound by the Maastricht Treaty. There's only so much that these countries can spend, even though arguably now is a time where these countries could be spending a little bit more to focus on these types of structural reforms. So how do you marry the two together?
Yes, since 2010, there is the process of the European semester in the European Union coordinating the policies, fiscal and structural. But I must admit that following the rules of the game has not been excellent in the European Union. We're now talking a lot about building the additional common fiscal capacities. But the truth is if we would have been sticking to the Growth and Stability Pact, the national fiscal buffers would have been created already. So the first task is, of course, to reduce the debt levels individually, so that to decrease the potential fiscal contingency effects that we were discussing before. The second one, it is really for the countries to understand that that the structural reforms make the difference. And the major areas where to invest, it is the education, giving the knowledge and skills to the people, using or maximizing the available human resources, which is still a problem in the European Union. We see that especially in the open and small economies, the wages are growing faster, still faster than the productivity rates. And it is of vital importance for the companies to invest in technology and use the advantage of the digital opportunities available today. It's just an essential precondition for future competitiveness. And the decrease of the inequality, that's still the challenge that the European Commission should, as the safeguarder of the rules, be following. And my idea is that, in general, the whole operational mode of the Commission has to be changed. The commissioners responsible for the structural reforms have to be in place, helping the national governments to implement the difficult, politically tough reforms, both with their authority, expertise, and the financial instruments fostering the structural reforms.
So having the right institutional framework, but then also spending on the right types of policies as well.
That's true. We are now in the beginning of the next multi-annual framework discussions, and I think this is a vital aspect that has to be kept into the mind. More investment if the country does their homework as well.
Phil, I'm going to direct this question from the audience to you, actually. I'll tie it into businesses somehow, but a question from Jose Juan Haro saying, what about structural reforms to foster investments in education and digital infrastructure inequalities will grow if countries are not prepared for the digital economy. What is your take?
Precisely, exactly. And it leads into what I was going to say anyway. Actually, there was a striking slide put up by the acting chief economist about education reform, skills reform. So if you think about ways to reduce inequality and ways to improve social cohesion, it's hard to go past skills, and it's hard to go past digital literacy when you think about those skills. A remarkable slide put up a half an hour ago or so, how much structural reform has gone on in nations to get the education system lined up with business needs. Well, zero, nothing. Big red bar there, right? So if you think about structural reform, we often go to the point that structural reform can be very expensive, it's going to cost billions and so on, and some of it is, of course. But 2 points about that. Not all structural reform is fiscally difficult. Changing around teaching and learning, sure, it's going to be costly, but you're already spending an awful lot on education anyway. And then some structural reform, to the point some of my colleagues have made, can actually be very good for productivity gains, digital infrastructure, for example, physical infrastructure, education infrastructure, and at the same time, it has the impact of improving cohesion, social cohesion, the opportunity to participate in the economy. So I think governments need to be much more imaginative and much more energetic about the types of reforms that they might be able to undertake, even if they're fiscally constrained.
Rich, I just want to pick up on this digital transformation point as well. And of course, it has caused a lot of anxiety amongst the working community. What can be done to ensure that technology and innovation is also benefiting the workers as well?
Well, first of all, in the United States at least, I'll speak of this, there's a stigma for vocational training or skills training. If in fact you don't go to college, it's sort of like you've failed somehow. And instead of encouraging skills training and vocational training, we don't. Now, the best known secret probably in the world is that other than the US military, nobody trains more people, skills people, every year than the American labor movement. Our apprenticeship programs train people to become journeymen. We train our journeymen to become more skilled journeymen. So that's an important thing. The question about technology and the new technology that you talked about that causes everybody anxiety is, what does it mean for me? And if the new technology is going to increase productivity and increase profits, where do they go and how are they shared? Because technology is just a tool. It can be used for good or it can be used for bad. If it's used for good, then we should have higher wages, more time off, more time with our family. If it's used for bad, it will continue to send all the profits all the way to the top and continue the striation that's out there. You stop that from happening by rebalancing the power between corporations and people. Corporations are too strong, workers are too weak in most of the labor markets, and so they don't get their fair share. Now, when we have collective bargaining, what has happened with us is when new technology came in, we would negotiate for a fair share of what that new technology and productivity did. We'd also negotiate to make the rough edges of that technology a little smoother. But society doesn't have that mechanism. They don't have a mechanism to say, how's that technology? How's artificial intelligence? How's robotics? How's all of that technology going to be shared? And as I said, it can be good or it can be bad. So you need to strengthen the institutions of working people, give them a stronger voice, and we need to do what we're doing now. Look at the future and start talking about how it's going to affect work and workers and reconcile the difference between the two in a multilateral, in a tripartite way, with government, business, and workers all together trying to say, here's the way it should be in the future. So
Here's what digital's done to workers, though. It's radically reduced prices for many, many of the things that we used to spend a lot of money on. And that's been a very good thing for workers. It's also allowed small and medium enterprises, small businesses, micro businesses, who used to be excluded from the global economy, that they can now trade and be part of the global economy. So I think we should look at both the good and the challenge of digital and not be scared of it. We should try and think of it. The OECD used to do a great deal of work on reducing the digital divide. That's what we need to think about, rather than having 20th century solutions for 21st century issues.
David, I know you need to leave. We got one comment from the audience saying the biggest risk would be to do nothing. So what is the message you'd like to leave our audience with today?
Actually, I might leave you with an environmental one. I think it's clear that none of us, no one country in the world can overcome the environmental challenges that we're facing. That if we don't as a world overcome these challenges, we're going to leave a pretty horrible place for our kids to follow in. That through cooperation through international institutions and following the recommendations that encourage proper levels of regulation and price to internalise into investment and consumption decisions the externalities which are currently ruining our planet, and we'll have a nice place in the world. Can I say just one final thing, responding to Phil on we've got some very moderate reforms to collective bargaining in New Zealand at the moment, and we've got a very deregulated labour market in New Zealand, and you know, like most of the world, we've suffered in recent decades a declining share of GDP going to labour. Despite those realities and despite the moderateness of those reforms, you'd think that, that those that have been getting an increasing share of GDP, which is flowing to capital, you'd think we're cutting their throats. There's a need for a bit of give and take here, and if we're going to maintain a public consensus for the sort of structural reforms that you and I both know are needed by the world economy, it should be take and give. Thanks.
Thank you.
I apologise for having to leave early.
I think Mr. Narine you had one interjection you wanted to make, and then I'm going to open it up to Q&A.
Sure. Just a very short issue on the digital economy. We're talking about digital literacy, which of course is important, the technological change, but we haven't discussed one important issue, which is the competition that comes from the digital economy to the established economy, and what that is provoking. In particular, the fact that in many countries, I think we're all trying to move to address this issue, but it's the issue of fair competition to established businesses from the digital economy. And some of this digital economy doesn't pay any taxes. So it's an issue also in terms of tax revenue, in terms of fairness of competition for those who are paying taxes and are abiding by the rules of the game from completely unregulated situations. So I think it is also an issue that we will need to address on the digital economy.
And of course, Europe are very much trying to address that now by advocating for a digital tax. Ms. Alzola, I know you have to leave as well, but final thoughts on perhaps digital taxation or taxing companies more efficiently as far as Europe is concerned?
Digital taxation is one of the examples that I would use when talking about the coordination of the policies. I wouldn't be eager to have the local European solutions like turnover tax. It would be necessary rather to have the global one. But one aspect of the new digital world that I would also like to raise, everybody is expecting the companies to be more dynamic and follow the pace. They will do it anyway because it's the matter of their survival. I think it's of vital importance that governments understand that they have to become much more dynamic as well. Two examples. One is regulation, that businesses are developing so fast that if you are regulating them as the way you were used to do it years ago or even today, you are too slow, you're restricting them too much. So the principle of the governance and regulation has to be changed totally, putting the framework and then letting them work within it. And the second one, the social security systems have to be revised. Yes, the digital gives a lot of opportunities, especially to SMEs, to smaller nations to compete globally, but it also does put the people in danger because the social care systems have been designed for the permanent jobs in the big factories. This is changing. The more freelancers are coming, the more risk that the people would be vulnerable in their senior ages. So the governments have to think already today how to change the whole system of the social security, envisaging the obligatory installments and things like that.
Excellent. And with that, I'm going to open up to Q&A. If anyone would like to go ahead. Question in the back there. Thank you.
Yes, good morning. My name is Nancy Gomez. Do you personally consider that a sovereign cryptocurrency can be a mean of defense and the blockchain a technology to increase the productivity of countries? Thank you.
Who was the question directed to?
Actually, it's for countries, so to ministers, maybe Chile, maybe...
Cryptocurrency.
Well, part of the issue with
sovereign cryptocurrency.
Sovereign cryptocurrency. So the question was about issuing sovereign cryptocurrency at a sovereign level, so each sovereign creating their own digital asset, essentially.
Yeah,
Okay.
as a mean of defense.
Well, I would have to say that we are at this stage not considering, the creation of a sovereign cryptocurrency. We are just trying to tackle the issue of the cryptocurrencies that have been, that have sort of mushroomed and have grown very significantly. You could consider that. I think it's an issue, but at the current stage, I think the key issue is how do you regulate the cryptocurrencies? And I would mention the risks that are of not regulating them. Well, one thing is that people who are investing in cryptocurrencies or crypto assets more generally would have to understand the risks that they are taking. There's no clear backing or collateral, or you wouldn't say where's the fundamental of this investment. It's just based on the confidence and the people that use them. So you have wild variations in their prices. The second issue is, of course, that we should be concerned about the money laundering, about the financing of terrorism, and other, and tax evasion, which is a third issue about these cryptocurrencies. So there is a part of it, which is the good part. The good part is that you have new technologies, and financial innovation involved in the crypto assets. And I would also mention, for the longer term on cryptocurrencies, that if they continue increasing, that there is a risk also to seigniorage, which is what the central banks collect for having the monopoly over money, of the monetary emission. And if you have competing currencies, well, that eats on the revenues that central banks take. So that is a central bank issue, but it's an issue for public policy as well. So, I mean, maybe central banks at a point would consider having their own cryptocurrencies, but I think this is an issue that will happen further down the line.
Question at the front.
Bonjour, je suis Sheikh Keita, je suis président de Bridge of Innovation et Open Business Africa. Alors j'ai deux questions. Nous avons parlé des risques de guerre commerciale, fiscalité, inclusion, la gouvernance, l'éducation, l'innovation, le numérique, mais nous n'avons pas parlé de la monnaie, pas en Europe, mais dans les autres pays, puisque nous parlons d'un monde globalisé. Je parle de l'Afrique, de l'Amérique latine, où nous avons des monnaies différentes. Et nous parlons de la problématique monétaire aussi, au niveau de l'inclusion, et aussi pour voir, est-ce qu'on peut réfléchir sur un modèle pour ces pays-là, pour essayer d'acter le développement de ces pays en termes de ressources et en termes d'infrastructures et aussi de numérique. La deuxième question est sur le numérique. Alors, le numérique devient une denrée indispensable à notre vie, comme l'eau que nous buvons. Une indispensabilité, une obligation. L'outil numérique, pouvons-nous rêver à un monde où l'accès à Internet est gratuit? Savez-vous combien un habitant des zones rurales en Afrique ou en Amérique latine paye pour accéder au numérique? Est-ce qu'on peut rêver que les entreprises de télécommunications puissent travailler pour leur partie développement durable et aussi responsabilité sociale pour qu'on puisse ouvrir grandement les portes du numérique. Parce que nous avons deux mondes aujourd'hui. Un monde où tout est possible pour l'accès au numérique et un monde où tout est impossible à l'accès au numérique. Merci bien.
Phil, would you like to tackle the second question? Or either one, actually.
Sorry, I heard half of that. On the issue of currency, that's obviously a question for each country to decide. But from my perspective and from a business perspective, a currency is just what it is. But at the end of the day, you're going to look through the currency to the competitiveness of the country. Am I prepared to invest here? Do I want to do business in this country? And from a domestic business perspective, currency is one thing, but if all you have is a weak dollar and nothing else is going for you, you don't have infrastructure, you don't have education, it's not going to help you much. So my sense is stop worrying so much about the currency issues and start worrying about competitiveness and productivity in the economy, particularly with regard to the growth of SMEs. When you talk about digital and access to digital, I completely agree. I mean, it'd be nice to have it free. I doubt we're going to get that. You need to talk to the telco companies about that. But you can certainly radically reduce the price of it, and this is exactly what we're talking about. The OECD is talking about investing in digital infrastructure, and in many of those countries that have large rural areas, New Zealand's one, that's often going to be mobile technology, not poles and wires. So there's a wonderful competitive opportunity, I think, for those countries that don't yet have much of that infrastructure to leapfrog countries that are in the OECD that have clearly invested in poles and wires in the past to actually go digital from day one and radically improve access and at the cheapness of digital. And that will be a key issue in getting inclusion in those societies. Think about entrepreneurial women in rural areas with access to a mobile phone that works at some sort of reasonable price. They are global traders the next day, potentially. So I'm incredibly excited about the opportunities associated with building out fit-for-purpose digital infrastructure, particularly in least developed and developing countries, and I think it's a key part of what we should be talking about.
We have 3 minutes left,
okay,
so I'm hoping we can squeeze in just one more question after Richard speaks.
I'll try to be very brief. I agree with most of what you said about currency, Phil. The one place I would urge some caution is when countries intervene into the marketplace to manipulate the price of their currency. That translates out into an unfair trade practice, and we have to figure out a way to adjust that and eliminate it. And when you come to, I would also like to see internet be accessible to everybody. We are having a fight in the United States right now, not to get it free, but to make sure the same price is charged to everyone, so that you don't have preferred customers that can have access to high-speed internet and other customers never get that access because they get charged such a high price for it. We call it net neutrality. That's a fight going on right now. You should watch it. Hopefully we'll prevail and the price will stay flat for everybody so that everybody has the same opportunities.
Final question, please.
Yes, Russell Mills. I have a question about the digital innovations, because they are obviously occurring at a pace that is happening much faster than the traditional policy-making processes. Now, all of us don't know for sure what this will bring in terms of the future for society, but businesses that are driving this probably know more about this than other people. Doesn't this mean that those businesses should be involved a little bit earlier in the policy-making process? And it's really a question for the Minister. Do you agree that this earlier innovation interaction will be vital? And if so, what kind of models would you see for that kind of cooperation, which I guess would be essential to make sure the impacts are beneficial for society?
The question was on the digital. Yes. Well, I totally agree in the sense that you know, we're coping with a new development, and you know, I think what normally happens is that you have the development and the regulation, and the way we tackle this, it comes with a lag, you know. So typically there is the innovation, and then we're seeing, okay, you know, how do we respond to this? And then we have a process in which, you know, during that period where we have no regulation, well, some good things happen, but there may be some bad things happening as well. So having an interaction with the private sector, but not just with the private sector, I would say, you know, with all parties that would have something to contribute, you know, And I would say, you know, with the entrepreneurs, with the innovators, but also with labor, how they see the process. And I think it's a very important thing to have this kind of interaction, this kind of cooperation, before you do regulation. In many countries, at least, you know, that I know a few, and among them in Chile, before you set a regulation, you put it, you know, as you put it, you know, for everyone to see and make comment before the regulation becomes, you know, a rule. So we say, okay, this is what we have, and we have a period for everybody to make a comment. And I think that is a good thing to have.
I'm afraid time is up, Rich, but quick 10 seconds, 20 seconds interjection.
It can't be a static process. It has to be a dynamic process where we're involved and we're ahead of the curve and workers are part of the process, as you noted. I would really encourage a dynamic process where we're constantly evaluating that.
So where's a good place we're doing that? The OECD. That's right here. It's where we should be doing it.
That's a nice way to end it. Gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for your participation, and hopefully you've all walked away with a better understanding of some of the challenges that are facing the global economy today, and also the importance of cooperation and building the right institutional framework to tackle some of the challenges that are coming from the technological space or even at a trade level as well. Thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, you did an excellent job.
Thank you. So the format works for you.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it was fine. It was just, we were expecting one thing, and then already at the last minute, we were going to do something else. I'm pretty flexible about this.
Great, thank you.
Great job there.
Thank you so much.
What, are you American?
I'm half Lebanese, half British. Yeah.
I'm a leading American member of the G20.
Hello. I just want to let you know that everyone needs to clear the room and take your personal belongings with you. We will be locking the room during the lunch period, so please make sure you take your personal belongings. Thank you. I can get the iPad. I've got her purse.
One